There was screaming from your house, my neighbor Mrs. Henderson said, her weathered hands gripping her coffee mug like a lifeline. Every night for the past week. Blood-curdling screams that kept the whole street awake. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stared at her across the small cafe table, my luggage still sitting by my feet. From the airport pickup. 2 weeks in Prague for the International Symposium on Medieval Architecture, and I come home to this. The conference had been a triumph. My presentation on Gothic cathedral restoration techniques had earned standing ovations and 3 job offers. Now I was sitting in a coffee shop 3 blocks from my house, afraid to go home. Mrs. Henderson, I said carefully, setting down my untouched latte, I've been out of the country for 2 weeks. You know this. You watered my plants, remember? Her pale blue eyes fixed on mine with the intensity of someone who'd seen too much. I know what I heard, Dr. Morgan. And I know what I saw. The way she said my name made my skin crawl. We'd been neighbors for 5 years, ever since I'd bought the Victorian house on Maple Street with the inheritance from my grandmother. She'd always called me Sarah before. What exactly did you see? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know Mrs. Henderson leaned forward, lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. Lights moving through your house at night. Not electric lights, something else. Something that cast shadows that moved wrong. And the screaming? She shuddered. It wasn't human, Sarah. Whatever was in your house, it wasn't human. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through the security notifications from my smart home system. Nothing. Not a single alert, motion detector trigger, or door sensor activation for the entire 2 weeks I'd been gone. The system had even faithfully recorded my plants being watered every other day, right on schedule. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The security system shows nothing, I said, showing her the app on my screen. She barely glanced at it. Technology can't see everything. The cafe suddenly felt too warm, too crowded. Other patrons were starting to glance our way, drawn by Mrs. Henderson's urgent whispers and my obvious distress. I needed to get home, needed to see for myself what had spooked my normally rational neighbor into believing in supernatural explanations. Did you call the police? I asked, gathering my purse. 3 times, she replied grimly. They found nothing. Said the house was secure, no signs of break-in, nothing disturbed. But they didn't stay long. And they didn't come back after the first night. That stopped me cold. What happened the first night? Mrs. Henderson's coffee mug rattled against the table as she set it down with shaking hands. Officer Martinez, you know, the young one who lives on Oak Street, he was doing a routine check around midnight. I watched from my bedroom window. He was walking around your house with his flashlight, checking the doors and windows like always. Then the screaming started. She paused, staring out the cafe window at something I couldn't see. He ran, Sarah. A police officer ran from your house like the devil himself was chasing him. His car was gone within minutes, and he never came back. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Officer Martinez was a decorated veteran, former military police. I'd seen him handle domestic disputes and drunk college students with calm professionalism. What could possibly make him run? Mrs. Henderson, I appreciate you telling me this, but there has to be a logical explanation. Maybe teenagers breaking in, or pipes making noise, or the Kowalski boy tried to egg your house last Halloween, she interrupted. You remember? 15 years old, thought he was so tough. He made it halfway up your front walk before he dropped the carton and ran home crying to his mother about the thing in your window. I did remember that. Tommy Kowalski, the neighborhood terror who'd been vandalizing property all month. His mother had brought him over the next day to apologize, and he'd been pale as a ghost, refusing to look at my house while he mumbled his sorry. He said there was someone watching him from your front window, Mrs. Henderson continued. But you were at that conference in Boston that weekend. House was empty then too. My mind raced back through the timeline. The Boston conference had been 3 months ago. If something had been happening in my house since then, why was I only hearing about it now? And why had it escalated to nightly screaming while I was in Prague? Why didn't you call me? I asked, pulling up our text history on my phone. Sure enough, her usual check-ins about the plants, nothing about supernatural disturbances. I tried, she said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. Every time I started to dial your number, my phone would die. Full battery 1 second, completely dead the next. And the one time I tried to email you, my computer crashed. Lost 3 hours of work on my genealogy project. The rational part of my brain, the part trained in historical research and evidence-based analysis, wanted to dismiss this as coincidence, hysteria, or both. But Mrs. Henderson was a retired librarian, methodical and precise in everything she did. She'd helped me research the history of my house when I'd first moved in, cross-referencing property records and newspaper archives with the thoroughness of a professional historian. Did anyone else hear the screaming? I asked. The whole street heard it. But she hesitated, fidgeting with her wedding ring. But when we tried to talk about it the next morning, something strange happened. The Johnsons across the street acted like nothing had happened. The Nakamuras claimed they'd slept through the night. Even the college students in the rental house next to yours, you know how thin those walls are, they swore they hadn't heard anything. I stared at her, processing this information. You think they're lying? I think they're forgetting, she said quietly. Or being made to forget. The coffee shop suddenly felt like a fishbowl, all eyes on our hushed conversation. I gathered my things quickly, desperate to escape the weight of stares and whispers. But as I stood to leave, Mrs. Henderson grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. Sarah, listen to me. Don't go home alone. Whatever's in that house, it's been waiting for you. I looked down at her weathered fingers wrapped around my wrist, noting how cold they felt despite the warm day. What aren't you telling me? She released my arm and pulled something from her purse, a small digital camera, the kind tourists use. I took pictures, she whispered, pressing it into my hands. The last 3 nights. Look at them when you get somewhere safe. The camera felt heavy in my palm, heavier than it should have. Mrs. Henderson, promise me you won't go in that house until you've looked at those pictures. Promise me. The desperation in her voice was impossible to ignore. I promise. She nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. Good. And Sarah? When you do go home, don't go alone. And don't go after dark. I left the cafe with more questions than answers, the camera burning a hole in my purse as I walked the 3 blocks toward home. The familiar tree-lined streets of Maple Heights looked exactly as I'd left them 2 weeks ago, pristine lawns, well-maintained Victorian houses, the kind of neighborhood where the biggest scandal was usually someone not bringing in their garbage cans fast enough, but something felt different now. Maybe it was Mrs. Henderson's words echoing in my mind, or maybe it was the way the afternoon shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, but the neighborhood that had always felt like a sanctuary now felt like it was holding its breath. I paused at the corner of Maple and Oak, my house visible in the distance. The 3-story Victorian looked exactly as I'd left it, dark green shutters freshly painted, wraparound porch swept clean, garden boxes overflowing with the late summer flowers Mrs. Henderson had been faithfully watering. Nothing out of place, nothing obviously wrong, but as I stood there, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. Every other house on the street showed signs of life, cars in driveways, porch lights on timers, the gentle hum of air conditioning units. My house stood in perfect, absolute silence, even the birds seemed to avoid it. I pulled out my phone and opened the security app again, scrolling through 2 weeks of data. Everything appeared normal. The system had armed and disarmed according to its program schedule. Motion sensors had detected Mrs. Henderson's plant watering visits. Even the smart thermostat had maintained the energy-saving temperatures I'd set before leaving, but now, looking at the data with fresh eyes, I noticed something odd. Every entry was timestamped during daylight hours. The system showed no activity whatsoever between sunset and sunrise for the entire 2 weeks. Not even the ambient motion that usually triggered when tree branches swayed in the wind or cats wandered through the yard. It was as if the house had been completely lifeless after dark. I found myself walking closer despite every instinct telling me to turn around. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across my front lawn, and I had a sudden, irrational fear of what might be hiding in them. Mrs. Henderson's camera seemed to pulse in my purse, and I realized I needed to look at those pictures before I went any further. But where? Going to a second coffee shop seemed excessive, and my curiosity was too strong to wait until I reached a friend's house. I noticed a small park bench across the street, positioned under a streetlight with a clear view of my house. Perfect. I settled onto the bench and pulled out the camera, my hands trembling slightly as I powered it on. The LCD screen flickered to life, showing the most recent photo in the memory. At first glance, it looked like a normal night shot of my house: dark windows, shadows of the porch columns, nothing unusual. Then I noticed the timestamp, 2:47 a.m., 3 nights ago. I squinted at the small screen, trying to make out details in the grainy low-light photo. The front of my house looked normal, but there was something in one of the second-floor windows. A pale shape that might have been a curtain, or might have been something else. The next photo, taken a minute later, showed the same window. The pale shape had moved. My mouth went dry as I clicked through the remaining images. Photo after photo of my house at various times throughout the night, and in each one, that pale shape appeared in different windows. Sometimes on the second floor, sometimes the third, once in what looked like the basement window well, but the final photo made my blood freeze. Timestamp, 5:23 a.m., last night. The pale shape wasn't in a window anymore. It was standing on my front porch, clearly visible in the pre-dawn light. And it was looking directly at the camera, looking directly at Mrs. Henderson's house. I dropped the camera, my hands shaking so badly I could barely pick it up again. When I forced myself to look at the image one more time, I could make out more details. The figure was tall, wearing what looked like a white nightgown or dress. Its hair hung long and dark around its face, and while I couldn't make out specific features on the small screen, there was something wrong with its posture. It stood too still, too straight, like a mannequin posed in a store window, but mannequins don't turn their heads to stare at their observers. I fumbled for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found Dr. Elizabeth Chen, my colleague from the university. If anyone would give me a rational perspective on the situation, it would be Liz. She answered on the third ring. Sarah. How was Prague? I've been dying to hear about the conference. Liz, I said, my voice coming out in a croak. I need a favor. A big one. Of course, what's wrong? You sound terrible. I looked across the street at my house, still sitting in perfect silence. I need somewhere to stay tonight. Maybe longer. And I need someone to help me figure out what's been happening in my house while I was away. What kind of what's been happening? I hesitated, knowing how insane it would sound. I'm not sure. But I don't think I should go home alone. Liz didn't ask for details, which was one of the many reasons I valued our friendship. Come over now. I'll order Chinese food and we can figure this out together. Do you need me to pick you up? No, I have my car. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Sarah? Liz's voice carried a note of concern I'd rarely heard from my unflappable colleague. Whatever's going on, we'll handle it. Okay? I nodded even though she couldn't see me. Okay. As I gathered my things and prepared to leave, I took one last look at my house. The afternoon shadows had grown longer, and in another hour or two, the sun would set completely. Whatever Mrs. Henderson had been hearing, whatever had been captured in those photographs, it seemed to come alive after dark. I was halfway to my car when I heard it, a sound so faint I almost missed it over the evening breeze. But once I heard it, I couldn't unhear it. A woman's voice, calling my name. Sarah. It drifted across the evening air, barely audible but unmistakably there. I turned back toward my house, scanning the windows for any sign of movement. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. But the voice came again, clearer this time. Sarah, come home. I ran to my car without looking back, Mrs. Henderson's camera clutched in my white-knuckled grip. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of my rearview mirror and saw a pale figure standing in my front yard, watching me leave. By the time I'd slammed on the brakes and turned around, the figure was gone, but I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was in my house, it knew I was back, and it was waiting for me to come home. Dr. Elizabeth Chen lived in a modern townhouse 15 minutes across the city, all clean lines and minimalist furniture that reflected her practical approach to life. I sat curled on her leather couch, a steaming cup of jasmine tea warming my hands while she examined Mrs. Henderson's camera through a magnifying glass she'd borrowed from her home office. These are definitely not trick photography, Liz said finally, setting down the camera with a thoughtful frown. The metadata is intact, no signs of digital manipulation. Whatever your neighbor photographed, it was physically there. I pulled my knees up to my chest, trying to process this confirmation of what I'd hoped was just an overactive imagination. So you're saying there really was someone in my house? Someone or something, Liz corrected, her academic precision showing through even in these bizarre circumstances. The question is how they got in without triggering your security system, and why they only appeared after dark. She pulled out her laptop and connected the camera, uploading the images to her photo analysis software. The pictures appeared on her large monitor, and in high resolution, the details were even more disturbing than I'd first realized. Look at this, Liz said, zooming in on the figure standing on my porch. See how the shadows fall around it? Or, rather, how they don't. I leaned forward, studying the screen. She was right. While every other object in the photo cast normal shadows from the streetlights, the pale figure seemed to exist in its own bubble of diffused illumination. Could be a camera artifact, I suggested hopefully. Possibly. But look at this sequence. She pulled up the photos in chronological order, creating a time-lapse effect. Watch how it moves between windows. The pale shape flowed through my house. Like water, appearing in rooms that weren't connected, transitioning between floors with no apparent use of stairs or hallways. In one frame it was in my third-floor study, in the next it was in the basement, then back to the second-floor guest room. That's not human movement patterns, Liz observed, her voice taking on the clinical tone she used when analyzing historical artifacts. Whatever this is, it doesn't follow normal physical laws. My phone buzzed with a text message. The number was unknown, but the words made my blood run cold. Why did you leave? I've been waiting so long for you to come home. I showed the screen to Liz, whose eyebrows shot up. When did you give out your number to anyone connected to your house? I didn't. I was already dialing my phone company, but the automated system informed me that the message had been sent from my own home phone number. The landline I disconnected 2 years ago when I switched to cellular service exclusively. Liz took the phone from my trembling hands and started typing rapidly on her laptop. I'm running a reverse lookup on that number. That's impossible. What? According to the phone company's database, that number doesn't exist. It was decommissioned when you canceled the service, but the records show it was never reassigned. It's been in digital limbo for 2 years. Another message appeared on my phone. The others tried to forget, but I won't let them. You can't forget me, Sarah. You made me a promise. I stared at the words, racking my brain for any memory of making a promise to anyone connected to my house. Liz, I need you to help me research something. The history of my house, not just the property records we looked at before, but everything. Police reports, newspaper archives, death certificates, anything you can find. She was already pulling up the university's database access. What specifically are we looking for? Deaths. Disappearances. Anything involving a woman who might have lived there before. I thought about the figure in the photographs, the long dark hair, the white dress. Probably someone young. As Liz began her search, I tried calling Mrs. Henderson to ask more questions, but her phone went straight to voicemail. I left a message asking her to call me back, but something about the silence on the other end of the line felt ominous. Sarah. Liz said after 20 minutes of intense typing and cross-referencing. I found something. Actually, I found several somethings, and none of them are good. She turned her laptop screen toward me, displaying a newspaper article from 1987. The headline read, Local Woman Missing After Domestic Dispute. Margaret Winters, age 28, disappeared from 1247 Maple Street after neighbors reported sounds of a violent altercation, Liz read aloud. That's your address? Her husband claimed she left him for another man, but police found signs of a struggle and blood evidence in the master bedroom. My master bedroom. The room I'd been sleeping in for 5 years, the room where I'd always felt slightly uncomfortable but attributed to the Victorian house's naturally creaky atmosphere. They never found her body, Liz continued, scrolling through related articles. The husband, Robert Winters, was questioned extensively but never charged. He sold the house 6 months later and moved to Florida. What happened to the house after that? Liz pulled up property records. It changed hands 4 times between 1987 and when you bought it in 2019. Each owner stayed less than 2 years. Look at this pattern. The Johnsons bought it in 1988, sold it in 1989. The Martinez family in 1990, gone by 1991. The Kowalskis, wait, like Tommy's family? No, different Kowalskis. But look at the trend. The Chen family, no relation to me, lasted from 1992 to 1995, which was the longest anyone stayed until you. Then it sat empty for almost 20 years before you bought it. I felt sick. Why didn't this come up in the property disclosure? Missing persons cases don't legally require disclosure unless there's been a confirmed death on the property. And look at this. She pulled up another document. The house was sold to you. Through a shell company registered in Delaware. The actual seller's identity is buried under layers of corporate paperwork. My phone buzzed again. You painted over my room. You threw away my things. But you can't erase me. Liz, I whispered, when I renovated the master bedroom, I found some old belongings in the walls. Women's clothing, jewelry, personal items. I thought they were just forgotten by previous owners. What did you do with them? I donated them to Goodwill. It seemed wrong to throw them away. Another message, you gave away my wedding dress. My mother's ring. Everything I treasured. Liz looked at me with growing concern. Sarah, I think we need to consider that you might be dealing with something beyond conventional explanation. You mean a ghost? The word felt ridiculous coming out of my mouth. I mean something that has an emotional attachment to that house and the belongings that were removed from it. Something that's been trying to get your attention for months. And your absence made it more desperate. I thought about Tommy Kowalski's Halloween encounter, about Officer Martinez running from my house, about the nightly screaming that had terrorized the neighborhood. It's been escalating. And now that you're back, it's trying to communicate directly. Liz gestured at my phone. The question is, what does it want? Before I could answer, my phone rang. Mrs. Henderson's number. I grabbed it eagerly, but the voice that answered wasn't my elderly neighbor's. Sarah? The voice was young, female, and filled with desperate longing. Why did you give away my things? Why did you paint over my beautiful wallpaper? I nearly dropped the phone. Who is this? You know who I am. You've been living in my house, sleeping in my bed, using my kitchen. But you tried to erase me. Liz was frantically typing, trying to trace the call. She held up her laptop screen showing that the call was coming from Mrs. Henderson's landline, but according to the phone company's live tracking, no call was being made from that number. What happened to Mrs. Henderson? I managed to ask. She's sleeping. I made her sleep so we could talk privately. She was becoming a problem, trying to scare you away from me. My blood went cold. Is she hurt? She's dreaming about her late husband. I thought that would be kinder than letting her worry about you. Liz was already grabbing her car keys and jacket. She mouthed police and headed for the door, but I held up a hand to stop her. If this entity could manipulate phones and make people forget, what could it do to officers who tried to interfere? What do you want from me? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I want you to come home. I want you to remember what you promised. I don't remember making any promise. You stood in my bedroom, our bedroom, the day you moved in. You found the loose floorboard where Robert hid my jewelry after he hurt me. You held my wedding ring and said, I promise to take care of this house and honor the memory of whoever lived here before. The memory hit me like a physical blow. I had said those words, whispered them almost unconsciously as I'd knelt on the bedroom floor, holding a simple gold band that had been wrapped in tissue paper and hidden beneath the floorboards. I'd been moved by the idea of a woman's precious possessions being preserved in such a careful way, never imagining they'd been hidden by her killer. You remember now, the voice said with satisfaction. You promised to honor my memory. But then you erased me instead. I didn't know, I whispered. I didn't know what had happened to you. Robert told everyone I left him for another man. He made them believe I was the kind of woman who would abandon her home, her wedding vows, everything I held sacred. But you could have learned the truth. You could have honored my memory properly. Liz was watching me with growing alarm, clearly. Hearing only my side of the conversation but understanding that something significant was happening. What do you want me to do? I asked. Come home. Come back to our house. I'll show you where he buried me, and you can make sure everyone knows what really happened. You can clear my name. And if I don't? The temperature in Liz's townhouse dropped noticeably, and frost began forming on the windows despite the warm evening outside. Then I'll keep screaming until someone listens. I'll keep appearing to your neighbors until they're too frightened to stay. I'll turn Maple Street into a place no one can live in peace. You're already doing that. This is nothing compared to what I can do when I'm truly angry. The voice was growing colder, more distant. Mrs. Henderson will wake up in the morning thinking she had a lovely dream about her husband. But the others, the ones who've been trying to ignore me, they won't be so lucky. The line went dead. Liz immediately called 911, requesting a welfare check on Mrs. Henderson, but I could barely focus on her conversation with the dispatcher. My mind was racing through the implications of what I'd just learned. Margaret Winters had been murdered in my house 37 years ago, her body hidden somewhere on the property, her killer long gone and possibly dead, and somehow, through a careless promise made during an emotional moment, I'd bound myself to help her. The police are on their way to check on your neighbor, Liz said, hanging up. But Sarah, we need to talk about what just happened. That conversation, it wasn't normal. None of this is normal. I slumped back on her couch, exhaustion finally catching up with me. Liz, what if she's telling the truth? What if there really is a body buried somewhere on my property? Then we call the police and let them handle it. But what if they don't find anything? What if she only reveals herself to me? I'll sound completely insane. Liz sat down beside me, her expression thoughtful. Not necessarily. There are documented cases of cold cases being solved through unconventional means. Anonymous tips, recovered evidence, people suddenly remembering suppressed details. If we approach this carefully, we might be able to point investigators in the right direction without claiming supernatural involvement. My phone buzzed with another message, tomorrow night. Come home tomorrow night, and I'll show you everything. Come alone, and I promise no one else will be hurt. She wants me to go back tomorrow night, I said, showing Liz the message. Absolutely not. We're not splitting up, and we're definitely not going to a potentially dangerous location in the dark based on demands from an unknown entity. But even as Liz spoke, I knew I was going to do exactly what Margaret wanted. The alternative was letting her terrorize the entire neighborhood indefinitely, and I couldn't live with that on my conscience. There's something else, I said quietly. When I first moved into the house, I used to have dreams. Strange, vivid dreams about a woman in a white dress standing in my bedroom, pointing at the floor. I always woke up feeling like she was trying to tell me something important. You never mentioned this before. I thought they were just stress dreams from the move, from starting a new job, from living alone for the first time. But what if they weren't dreams? What if she's been trying to communicate with me all along? Liz's phone rang, the police calling back about Mrs. Henderson. I listened as she explained that officers had found the elderly woman sleeping peacefully in her chair, apparently unharmed but deeply asleep. They'd been unable to wake her despite repeated attempts, and paramedics were en route. She's alive but unresponsive, Liz reported after hanging up. They're taking her to the hospital for observation. I felt a mixture of relief and guilt. Margaret had kept her word about not hurting Mrs. Henderson, but the demonstration of her power was unmistakable. She could manipulate people's consciousness, affect electronic devices, and apparently exist in some form that could be photographed but not detected by conventional security systems. I have to go back, I said finally. If there's even a chance that she's telling the truth about where her body is buried, I owe it to her to help. And if I don't, she'll keep escalating until someone gets seriously hurt. Then we go together. And we bring back up. She said to come alone. Then she'll have to settle for compromise, Liz said firmly. Because you're not walking into a potentially supernatural situation without support, and that's non-negotiable. As if in response to her words, every light in the townhouse flickered, and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. On the frosted window, words began appearing as if written by an invisible finger, alone, or everyone suffers. Liz stared at the message, her academic skepticism finally cracking. Okay, she said quietly. I'm officially out of rational explanations. But I was already formulating a plan. If Margaret wanted me to come alone, I would. But that didn't mean I had to go unprepared. Tomorrow night, I would return to 1247 Maple Street and finally learn the truth about what had happened to Margaret Winters, and I had a feeling that once I knew the truth, there would be no going back to my normal life. The next day passed in a blur of preparation and growing dread. Despite Liz's protests, I was determined to honor Margaret's demand to come alone, but I wasn't going in completely defenseless. I spent the morning gathering supplies: a high-powered flashlight, my phone with a fully charged backup battery, a digital voice recorder, and a small emergency beacon that would alert campus security if I didn't check in every hour. I also made one crucial stop that I didn't tell Liz about. St. Catherine's Catholic Church sat on the corner of Elm and 3rd, its Gothic spires a familiar sight from my daily commute to the university. Father Miguel Santos had been the parish priest for over 15 years, and his reputation for discretion and wisdom made him the perfect person to confide in about my supernatural predicament. "Dr. Morgan," he greeted me warmly as I entered his office. "It's been some time since I've seen you at Mass." "Father Santos, I need to ask you about something that might sound unusual." I sat across from his desk, noting the late afternoon sun streaming through the stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the room. "Do you believe in ghosts?" He leaned back in his chair, studying my face with the careful attention of someone who'd heard countless confessions and crises of faith. "I believe in souls that find it difficult to move on to the next realm, particularly when they've suffered trauma or injustice." "Why do you ask?" I told him everything: Margaret's disappearance, the escalating supernatural activity, the promise I'd unknowingly made, and tonight's planned confrontation. Father Santos listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as if supernatural encounters were a regular part of his pastoral duties. "You're describing a classic case of an earthbound spirit seeking resolution," he said when I finished. "The question is whether this Margaret Winters truly needs your help to find peace, or whether something darker has taken residence in your home." "How can I tell the difference?" He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small silver medallion on a chain. "This is a St. Michael pendant, blessed specifically for protection against malevolent entities. If what you're dealing with is truly the spirit of Margaret Winters seeking justice, it will provide comfort to both of you. If something else is masquerading as her, what then? Then you leave immediately and call me. Don't try to be a hero, Dr. Morgan. Some battles require professional intervention." I accepted the pendant, feeling its surprising weight as I slipped it over my neck. "Thank you, Father." "One more thing," he said as I prepared to leave. "True spirits seeking resolution are bound by certain rules. They cannot force you to help them, only request it. If you find yourself compelled to act against your will, if you feel your thoughts becoming clouded or not your own, that's a sign you're dealing with something much more dangerous." By 6 p.m., I was parked across the street from my house, watching the shadows lengthen as the sun set behind the Victorian's ornate roofline. The neighborhood looked peaceful: children playing in yards, couples walking dogs, the normal rhythms of suburban evening life. But I noticed that no one lingered near my property, and the street seemed to grow quieter as darkness approached. My phone buzzed with a text from Liz: "Last chance to let me come with you." I typed back, "I'll be fine. Check in with you at midnight. If I don't hear from you by 12:01, I'm calling every emergency service in the city." At exactly 7 p.m., as the last light faded from the sky, I crossed the street and approached my front door. The key turned easily in the lock, and my security system chirped its normal greeting as I disarmed it. Everything appeared normal. No sign of disturbance, no evidence that anyone had been inside during my absence, but the house felt different. The air was charged with an electric tension that made my skin prickle, and despite the warm evening outside, the interior temperature was noticeably cool. "Margaret?" I called out, feeling foolish but needing to announce my presence. "I'm here, like you asked." The response came immediately, not a voice, but a gentle tug at my consciousness, as if someone was taking my hand and leading me toward the stairs. I followed the sensation up to the second floor, my footsteps echoing in the unusual silence. The pull led me to the master bedroom, where I stopped short. The room looked exactly as I'd left it 2 weeks ago, but now I could see it through different eyes. The hardwood floors I'd painstakingly refinished, the neutral paint that had covered whatever original wallpaper Margaret had chosen, the modern furniture that had replaced whatever had been here before. I had indeed erased her presence, just as she'd accused. "I'm sorry," I said aloud. "I didn't know." The bedroom's antique mirror began to fog over, and words appeared in the condensation: "Look under the window seat." I knelt beside the built-in bench beneath the bay window, running my hands along its edges until I found a small gap in the wood paneling. Inside was a metal box, tarnished with age but still intact. My hands trembled as I opened it, revealing a collection of items that painted a picture of Margaret's life: photographs of a young woman with dark hair and kind eyes, love letters written in a man's careful script, and most heartbreaking of all, a pregnancy test and a doctor's note confirming what the test revealed: Margaret had been pregnant when she died. The mirror fogged again. He killed us both. I sank to the floor, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the tragedy. This wasn't just about a missing woman or even a murder, it was about the destruction of an entire future, a family that never got to exist. Where? I whispered. The temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees, and my breath began to mist. The sensation of being led returned, stronger this time, pulling me toward the bedroom's bay window. I looked out into the backyard, but in the darkness, I could see nothing unusual. Then the motion sensor lights I'd installed last year clicked on, illuminating the garden area behind the house. The automatic sprinkler system activated, creating a grid of water across the lawn, and in the spray pattern, I could see where the water fell differently in one particular spot. The ground there was settled, compacted in a way that suggested it had been disturbed decades ago and had never quite recovered its original density. The rose garden, I breathed, remembering my first spring in the house when I'd been puzzled by why nothing would grow properly in that corner of the yard despite my best efforts with soil amendments and fertilizer. I grabbed my flashlight and headed downstairs, stopping in the kitchen to retrieve a small gardening spade from the utility closet. If Margaret was right, if her body was buried in my backyard, I needed to find evidence that would convince the police to take this seriously. The backyard felt different at night, shadows seeming to move independently of the wind, and the familiar sounds of neighborhood evening activity strangely muted. I made my way to the corner where the rose bushes struggled to thrive, kneeling in the damp soil and beginning to dig. I'd only gone about 18 inches down when my spade struck something hard. Not a rock, something that gave slightly under pressure but held its shape. My heart pounding, I used my hands to carefully clear away more soil, and in the beam of my flashlight, I saw what looked like a piece of deteriorated fabric, white fabric. "Oh God," I whispered, pulling out my phone to call 911. But before I could dial, I heard footsteps on the gravel pathway behind me. "Sarah? What the hell are you doing?" I spun around to find Officer Martinez approaching, his flashlight trained on me as I knelt beside the partially excavated hole. He looked older than I remembered, his face lined with stress and his eyes holding a wariness that hadn't been there before. "Officer Martinez, thank God you're here. I think I found something. I think there's a body buried in my yard." He stopped. About 10 feet away, his hand resting on his service weapon. "Sarah, I need you to step away from the hole and put your hands where I can see them." Something in his tone made my blood run cold. "What's wrong?" "We've been getting reports about you all day. Erratic behavior, trespassing at the church, disturbing your neighbor. Dr. Chen called us worried that you might be having some kind of breakdown." I stared at him in confusion. "That's not. I wasn't trespassing at the church. Father Santos invited me to talk. And I haven't seen Mrs. Henderson since yesterday." "Mrs. Henderson is still in the hospital, Sarah. She's been asking for you, claiming you're in some kind of danger. We found evidence that someone broke into her house last night." The world tilted. None of this made sense. I hadn't broken into anyone's house, and Liz would never have called the police to report me as unstable. Unless, what exactly did Dr. Chen tell you? I asked carefully. Martinez's expression softened slightly. "She said you've been acting paranoid. Claiming your house is haunted, talking about dead people trying to communicate with you. She's worried you might hurt yourself." I felt the St. Michael pendant grow warm against my chest as understanding dawned. This wasn't Officer Martinez. The real Martinez had run from my house in terror 3 nights ago and never returned. Whatever was speaking to me now was wearing his face, using his voice, but it wasn't him. "You're not real," I said, backing toward the house, the thing wearing. Martinez's appearance smiled, and its eyes reflected the light like an animal's. "I'm as real as your promise, Sarah. As real as your guilt about erasing poor Margaret's memory." The facade began to crack, literally. Martinez's face started to shift and blur, revealing something underneath that made my vision swim. The voice changed too, becoming layered, as if multiple people were speaking in unison. Did you really think Margaret was the only one? This house has been collecting souls for decades, Sarah. We've been so lonely, waiting for someone like you. Someone sensitive enough to hear us, foolish enough to make promises. I ran for the back door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. The windows too began slamming closed, one by one, sealing me outside with whatever was masquerading as Officer Martinez. The thing about promises, the entity continued, its voice growing deeper and more distorted, is that once made, they bind you to us. Margaret was just the bait. She drew you here, made you dig, made you open the door between worlds. I pressed myself against the back door, fumbling for the emergency beacon in my pocket. But when I pressed it, instead of the reassuring beep that meant help was coming, I heard only static. No one's coming, Sarah. No one can hear you now. The false Martinez began to approach, its movements jerky and unnatural. Behind it, other figures emerged from the shadows, pale shapes in old-fashioned clothing, their faces indistinct but their hunger unmistakable. But then the St. Michael pendant blazed with sudden warmth, and a new voice cut through the growing supernatural chaos. Leave her alone. A young woman stepped out of the darkness near the rose garden, and I recognized her immediately from the photographs I'd found upstairs. Margaret Winters looked exactly as she had in life, dark hair flowing around her shoulders, wearing the white dress she died in, but her presence brought a sense of peace rather than terror. Margaret? I whispered. She nodded, her attention focused on the false Martinez. You have no claim on her. She made her promise to me, not to you. Promises bind to the house, the entity snarled. All promises made within these walls belong to us. Not promises made in love and respect for the dead, Margaret replied firmly. Those belong to heaven. The supernatural battle that followed was unlike anything I could have imagined. The false Martinez and its shadowy companions pressed forward, but Margaret stood between them and me, her presence creating a barrier they couldn't cross. The pendant around my neck grew almost too hot to bear, but I didn't dare remove it. Sarah, Margaret called to me without taking her eyes off the dark entities. I need you to finish what you started. Dig deeper. Find my wedding ring, it's still on my finger. When the police come, that's how they'll identify me and reopen Robert's case. How do I know you're really Margaret? I asked, remembering Father Santos's warning about entities that could masquerade as others. She turned to look at me then, and her eyes held a warmth and sadness that couldn't be faked. Because I'm asking you to do something that will help me. Leave this place forever. The others want to keep me here, use my story to trap more souls. But I just want Robert to face justice for what he did, so I can finally rest. That was the difference Father Santos had described, a true spirit seeking resolution versus entities seeking to trap and feed. Margaret wanted to leave, the others wanted to stay and grow stronger. I grabbed my spade and began digging furiously while Margaret held back the dark presence. The soil was easier to move now, as if the earth itself wanted to give up its secrets. 3 feet down, my flashlight illuminated the unmistakable curve of human ribs, and there, still circling a delicate finger bone, was a simple gold wedding band. The moment I touched the ring, everything changed. The false Martinez screamed and dissolved, taking its shadowy companions with it. The oppressive weight I'd been feeling for days lifted like fog in sunlight, and the temperature returned to normal. Margaret knelt beside me as I carefully extracted the ring. Thank you, she whispered. I can go home now. What about the others? The entities that were pretending to be Officer Martinez? They're gone too, for now. This house won't be safe for long. Places like this attract the lost and the hungry. But you've given me what I needed to find peace, and that breaks their strongest hold on this place. She was already beginning to fade, becoming translucent in the moonlight. Sarah, call the real police. Tell them you found something while gardening. Don't mention me, just let the evidence speak for itself. Will I see you again? Margaret smiled, and for a moment she looked as young and happy as she had in her wedding photos. I hope not, dear. I hope I'm finally going where I belong. She disappeared, leaving me alone in my backyard with a partially excavated grave and a wedding ring that would finally bring justice for Margaret Winters and her unborn child. But as I reached for my phone to call 911, I realized that this was only the beginning. Margaret had said the house attracted the lost and hungry, and that the dark entities were gone for now. Whatever had been masquerading as Officer Martinez wasn't Margaret's killer, it was something far older and more Dangerous that had been using my house as a hunting ground for decades, and now that Margaret was gone, I was alone with whatever other secrets the house was hiding. The police arrived within minutes of my 911 call, their red and blue lights painting the Victorian's facade in alternating colors as neighbors gathered on the sidewalk to gawk at the commotion. Detective Rachel Morrison, no relation to my ex-husband James from another life, I noted with dark irony, took charge of the scene with professional efficiency. Ms. Morgan, I understand you were doing some late-night gardening when you made this discovery? Her tone was carefully neutral, but I caught the skepticism underlying her question. I couldn't sleep, I said, which was true enough. I thought some yard work might help, and I've been having trouble with that corner of the garden. Nothing grows there properly. The forensics team was already setting up floodlights and marking off the area with crime scene tape. In the harsh artificial illumination, the partially exposed remains looked starkly real in a way they hadn't by flashlight. I forced myself to look away as they began the careful process of excavation. How long have you lived here, Ms. Morgan? 5 years this October. Detective Morrison made notes on her tablet. And you've never noticed anything unusual about this area of your yard before tonight? I hesitated, thinking about Margaret's spirit and the supernatural battle that had taken place less than an hour ago. I always had trouble getting plants to grow there, despite trying different soil amendments. And sometimes I had strange dreams about that corner of the yard. What kind of dreams? A woman in white, standing by the rose bushes, pointing at the ground. It was close enough to the truth, and dreams seemed like something a detective might accept more readily than ghostly visitations. Detective Morrison? One of the forensics technicians called out. You need to see this. We approached the excavation site, where the team had carefully exposed most of a human skeleton. Even to my untrained eye, it was clearly an adult female, small-boned and delicate. She was wearing the tattered remains of what had once been a white dress, and the wedding ring I'd found was bagged and tagged as evidence. Looks like she's been here a long time, the technician observed. Probably 30 to 40 years, based on the degree of decomposition and the clothing style. We'll know more after the medical examiner takes a look. Detective Morrison pulled out her phone and made a quick call. I caught fragments of her conversation: possible cold case, female remains, significant age, run missing persons reports from the 80s. While the police worked, I noticed that the real Officer Martinez had arrived as backup. He looked pale and shaken, standing as far from my house as possible while still technically being on the scene. Our eyes met across the yard, and I saw recognition there, and fear. He remembered his encounter 3 nights ago, even if he couldn't explain it. Miss Morgan, Detective Morrison returned to my side. We're going to need you to come to the station tomorrow to give a formal statement. Tonight, though, you'll need to stay somewhere else. This is now an active crime scene. I nodded, pulling out my phone to call Liz. But before I could dial, Mrs. Henderson appeared at the edge of the crowd, looking frail but determined. She'd apparently discharged herself from the hospital against medical advice. Sarah, dear, she called out, pushing through the gathered neighbors. I had to come. I had to see for myself. Detective Morrison intercepted her. Ma'am, this is a crime scene. I need you to step back. I'm the one who's been calling about the disturbances, Mrs. Henderson said firmly. I'm the one who saw the lights in the house when Sarah was out of town. I have information relevant to your investigation. The detective's expression sharpened. What kind of information? Mrs. Henderson looked directly at me as she spoke. I've been living on this street for 43 years, Detective. I remember when Margaret Winters went missing in 1987. Her husband told everyone she'd run off with another man, but those of us who knew her, we never believed it. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the night air. Mrs. Henderson had known about Margaret all along. You knew? I whispered. I knew Margaret, she replied quietly. She was my friend. She used to come over for coffee and talk about how excited she was about the baby. She would never have left willingly. Detective Morrison was taking rapid notes. Why didn't you report your suspicions at the time? I did. But Robert Winters had connections in the police department back then. My concerns were dismissed. The bitterness in her voice suggested a long-held frustration with official inaction. And the recent disturbances you reported? Mrs. Henderson glanced around at the crowd of neighbors, then lowered her voice. Strange sounds coming from the house while Sarah was away. Lights moving through the rooms. And she hesitated. And I saw someone in the yard 2 nights ago. A woman in white, standing right about where you found the remains. Several neighbors nodded, apparently remembering their own unexplained experiences. The Nakamuras admitted to hearing screaming despite their earlier denials. The college students mentioned strange cold spots on their shared property line. Even the Johnsons reluctantly acknowledged unusual shadows they dismissed as tricks of light. Detective Morrison was clearly struggling to process testimony that bordered on the supernatural. So you're saying multiple residents experienced unusual phenomena in connection with this property? We're saying something's been trying to get our attention, Mrs. Henderson said simply. And now we know why. As the forensics team continued their work, I found myself standing apart from the crowd, processing the revelation that Mrs. Henderson had known Margaret personally. The elderly woman approached me, her expression kind but serious. I should have told you when you first moved in, she said quietly. But I hoped that maybe Margaret had finally found peace. When the strange things started happening again, I knew she was still here, still waiting for justice. Why didn't you just tell me the truth yesterday? Because I needed you to find her yourself. If I'd told you where to dig, would you have believed me? Would the police have taken it seriously? She gestured toward Detective Morrison, who was interviewing neighbors with obvious skepticism about their supernatural claims. But this way, you discovered her on your own. The evidence speaks for itself. I thought about Margaret's gentle guidance. The way she'd led me to her hidden belongings and then to her grave. She knew, didn't she? She knew you were her friend, that you'd been trying to help all these years. Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with tears. I hope so, dear. I truly hope so. My phone buzzed with a text from Liz. Saw the news. On my way to pick you up. But as I looked at the message, the words began to shift and change on the screen, rearranging themselves into something else entirely. The old woman knows more than she's telling. Ask her about the others. I blinked hard, and when I looked again, the text was back to Liz's original message. But the cold weight in my stomach told me that Margaret's departure hadn't ended my supernatural troubles, it had only revealed deeper layers to them. Mrs. Henderson, I said carefully, when you mentioned Margaret, you said the others. What others? Her expression grew guarded. What do you mean? You said those of us who knew her never believed Robert's story. How many others were there? Before she could answer, Detective Morrison called out, Miss Henderson, I need to get your full statement. About your relationship with the victim and your knowledge of the 1987 case. As Mrs. Henderson was led away to speak with the detective, I noticed Officer Martinez approaching. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in the past 3 days. Ms. Morgan. He said quietly, I need to apologize for the other night. I can't explain what happened, but I want you to know it wasn't professional, and it won't happen again. What do you remember about that night? He glanced around to make sure no one was listening. I remember walking around your house, doing a routine check. Everything seemed normal until. He paused, struggling with the memory. Until I heard something inside. Not the screaming the neighbors reported, something else. Like multiple voices whispering my name. What did you do? I tried to call for backup, but my radio died. Then my flashlight went out. And when I reached for my service weapon, my hand wouldn't move. It was like something was controlling my body, trying to make me enter the house. He shuddered. I've never felt terror like that in my life. Whatever was in there, it wanted me inside. But you got away. Something changed. Suddenly the presence lifted, like whatever had been holding me released its grip. I could move again, think again. So I ran. He looked ashamed. 15 years on the force, and I ran from a house like a scared kid. I thought about Margaret, wondering if she'd been the one to break the dark entity's hold on Officer Martinez. That night. You did the right thing. Did I? Because whatever's in that house, Ms. Morgan, finding that body isn't going to make it go away. If anything. He gestured toward the excavation site, where the forensics team was carefully removing Margaret's remains. If anything, you might have made it stronger. Before I could ask what he meant, Liz arrived, pushing through the crowd with characteristic determination. She took one look at the crime scene and immediately put a protective arm around my shoulders. Are you hurt? When I saw the news about human remains found at your address, I nearly had a heart attack. I'm fine. Shaken up, but fine. Good, because you're staying with me until this is sorted out. She looked around at the assembled police, neighbors, and media crews that were starting to arrive. This is going to be a circus for weeks. Detective Morrison approached us with her tablet ready. Ms. Morgan, before you leave, I need contact information where you'll be staying and your availability for tomorrow's interview. I gave her Liz's address and phone number, but as she was typing, her tablet screen flickered and went black. She tried to restart it, but the device remained dead. Technology malfunction, she muttered, pulling out an old-fashioned notepad. Seems to be going around tonight. As we talked, I noticed that several of the police officers were having equipment problems. Radio static, dead batteries and flashlights that had been working minutes before, patrol car computers freezing up. The forensics team was having better luck, but even they were experiencing intermittent issues with their digital cameras. Has this been happening all night? I asked Detective Morrison. Started about an hour ago, right around the time we began the excavation. She looked frustrated. We're going to have to rely on old-school documentation methods until we can figure out what's causing the interference. Liz and I exchanged glances. We both knew what was causing the interference, but neither of us was about to suggest supernatural involvement to a detective already struggling with witness testimony about ghostly sightings. As we prepared to leave, Mrs. Henderson broke away from her interview and hurried over to us. Sarah, there's something else you need to know. Something I couldn't say in front of the police. What is it? She glanced around nervously, then leaned in close. Margaret wasn't the first woman to disappear from that house. In 1962, a young bride named Helen Cassidy vanished just 3 months after moving in with her new husband. In 1934, Anna Kowalski, grandmother to the Tommy you know, went missing from the same address. My blood went cold. How many? I've been researching the house's history since the strange occurrences started. As far back as I can trace, there's been a pattern. Young women, newly married or recently moved in, disappearing under mysterious circumstances every 20 to 30 years. But why wasn't this in the property records? Because they were all reported as runaways or missing persons, never as homicides. The cases were never officially connected. Mrs. Henderson's voice dropped to barely a whisper. But I think someone, or something, has been using that house to hunt for decades. Liz grabbed my arm. We're leaving. Now. But as we walked toward her car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Looking back at my house, now surrounded by police tape and floodlights, I saw a pale figure standing in one of the upper windows. It wasn't Margaret. This presence felt different, older, more malevolent. And as I watched, more figures began appearing in other windows, shadows of women who had disappeared from 1247 Maple Street over the decades. Margaret had found peace and moved on. But the others were still there, still trapped, still waiting for someone to uncover their stories, and now that I'd opened the door by finding Margaret's body, they all wanted my help. The house had been collecting souls for generations, and I'd just volunteered to be their advocate. The next 3 weeks transformed 1247 Maple Street from a quiet family home into the epicenter of the largest cold case investigation in the city's history. What began with Margaret Winter's remains quickly evolved into something far more extensive when Detective Morrison, despite her initial skepticism, decided to follow Mrs. Henderson's research leads. I sat in the detective's office on a gray October morning, watching her spread crime scene photos and historical documents across her desk. The evidence was overwhelming, even for someone trained to dismiss coincidence. We've now confirmed the identities of 4 victims, Detective Morrison said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd been working 18-hour days. Margaret Winters, 1987. Helen Cassidy, 1962. Anna Kowalski, 1934. And yesterday, we identified the remains we found in the basement foundation, Patricia Murphy, who disappeared in 1923 shortly after the house was built. Each discovery had followed the same pattern. I would spend time in the house during daylight hours, allowing the spirits to guide me to hidden locations, a loose brick in the basement wall, a sealed section behind the kitchen pantry, disturbed earth beneath the front porch. The women would appear to me in dreams or reflective surfaces, pointing toward their burial places with the same gentle persistence Margaret had shown. The medical examiner confirmed that all 4 women died from blunt force trauma to the skull. Detective Morrison continued. Same general methodology, though obviously different perpetrators given the timeline spanning nearly a century. Different perpetrators? I asked, though I suspected I knew where this was leading. The house changed hands frequently, but there's a pattern. Each family who owned it included a man with a history of domestic violence, and each time, a young woman disappeared within the first few years of residence. She pulled out a genealogy chart that Mrs. Henderson had helped compile. Here's the disturbing part: 3 of the murderers were related. Great-grandfather, grandfather, and father. All owned the house at different times. And the 4th? Robert Winters wasn't related by blood, but we found evidence that he'd been introduced to the property through a family friend, Patricia Murphy's great-nephew. It's as if knowledge of the house's particular uses was being passed down through specific networks. Liz, who'd been sitting quietly beside me, finally spoke up. You're describing what sounds like a generational conspiracy. That's exactly what I'm describing, Detective Morrison confirmed. We think this house was deliberately used as a killing ground by men who knew they could hide bodies there without discovery. The property's layout, the isolated location, the basement's unusual construction, it was purpose-built for concealment. But I knew there was more to it than human conspiracy. During my time in the house over the past weeks, I'd sensed something deeper, older, more malevolent than the spirits of the murdered women. The dark presence that had masqueraded as Officer Martinez hadn't been destroyed when Margaret found peace, it had simply retreated, waiting. Detective, I said carefully, have you experienced anything unusual while investigating the house? Her professional mask slipped slightly. Define unusual. Equipment malfunctions. Cold spots. Voices when no one's there. She was quiet for a long moment. My team has reported some anomalous readings. And yes, we've had persistent technical difficulties that our IT department can't explain. She looked directly at me. Ms. Morgan? Off the record, what do you think is really happening in that house? I glanced at Liz, who nodded encouragingly. We discussed this moment, when to reveal the full truth about the supernatural elements of the case. I think the house itself is somehow infected, I said slowly. I think decades of violence and murder have created something that feeds on tragedy and draws violent people to it. The human conspirators were tools, but they weren't the ultimate source. Detective Morrison leaned back in her chair. That's a hell of a theory. It explains why the murders stopped for 23 years before I moved in. The house was empty, abandoned. Whatever lives there needs human presence to manipulate and corrupt. And it explains why the supernatural activity escalated when you returned from Prague, Liz added. It had been building power during your absence, feeding on the trapped spirits, preparing for your return. But Margaret's free now, I continued. She found peace when her killer was exposed. And over the past few weeks, as we've uncovered each burial site and identified each victim, I've watched them find peace too. The house is losing its hold on them. Detective Morrison opened a thick folder labeled Related Incidents. That correlates with what we've observed. Each time we discover remains and make a positive identification, the electromagnetic disturbances in the house decrease measurably. Have you found them all? Liz asked. I closed my eyes, reaching out with the sensitivity that had made me a target. In the first place, the house felt lighter somehow. Still wrong, still dangerous, but no longer filled with the desperate whispers of trapped souls. Yes, I said with certainty. The women are all free now. But the original corruption remains. Detective Morrison pulled out a legal document from the bottom of her stack. Which brings us to this. The city is prepared to condemn the property as structurally unsound due to the extensive excavation damage. But given the historical significance of what we've uncovered, there's also talk of preserving it as some kind of memorial. Absolutely not, I said immediately. That house cannot be preserved. It cannot be allowed to stand. Why? Because it will find new victims. Maybe not immediately, maybe not for years, but eventually, it will draw another violent person to it. The cycle will start again. I thought about my conversation with Father Santos the week before, when I'd asked him about cleansing the property. His answer had been sobering. some places become so saturated with evil that they cannot be purified, only destroyed. What are you proposing? Detective Morrison asked. Complete demolition. Level the house, excavate the foundation, remove every trace of the original structure. Then consecrate the ground and build something entirely different, a park, maybe, or a community center. Something filled with life and light. Detective Morrison made notes as I spoke. The insurance investigation supports demolition anyway. Apparently, your homeowner's policy has a very specific exclusion for discovered burial sites that voids coverage for the property. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. After everything we'd uncovered, I was most likely to be financially ruined by insurance technicalities. However, she continued, the families of the identified victims have been in contact with the city about establishing a memorial fund. They want to compensate you for your role in bringing their loved ones justice. I don't want compensation, I said firmly. I just want that house gone. 3 weeks later, I stood across the street with Mrs. Henderson, Liz, and what felt like half the neighborhood, watching the demolition crew tear down 1247 Maple Street. The Victorian's ornate facade, which had hidden so many secrets, came down. In sections, each beam and board carefully examined for evidence before being hauled away. Mrs. Henderson squeezed my hand as the roof collapsed in a controlled implosion. Margaret would be proud, she said quietly. She always said the house felt wrong, even when she was alive. You never told me you'd spoken to her about it. She mentioned it the last time I saw her, just a few days before she disappeared. She said she'd been having nightmares about the previous women who'd lived there, dreams about them trying to warn her about something. Mrs. Henderson's voice grew thoughtful. I wonder now if she wasn't psychically sensitive, like you. Maybe. That's why she was able to reach out to you so effectively. As the demolition continued, I felt a gradual lifting of the oppressive weight I'd carried for months. The dark presence that had clung to the property was dissipating, its anchor point being systematically destroyed. What will you do now? Liz asked as we watched the foundation being excavated and removed. Travel, maybe. Write a book about architectural preservation that doesn't involve supernatural murder. I pulled out the real estate listing I'd printed that morning. There's a lovely colonial in the University District that has a completely boring history of happy families and natural deaths. No Victorian houses? Never again. Father Santos approached our group, having come to bless the site once the demolition was complete. He'd been a constant source of support throughout the investigation, helping me understand the spiritual mechanics of what we'd encountered. The ground feels clean now, he observed, watching the last of the foundation stones being hauled away. Whatever was anchored here has been fully severed. Will it find somewhere else to go? Entities like that don't relocate so much as fade. They need specific conditions to maintain their power, years of accumulated tragedy, architectural spaces that can trap and hold spiritual energy, victims to feed on. Without those elements, they simply dissipate back into whatever darkness spawned them. Detective Morrison joined us as the cleanup crew began spreading fresh soil over the excavated lot. Final count was 97 pieces of evidence that we'll be using to officially close 4 cold cases. Your house just became the most productive crime scene in department history. Former house, I corrected. Former house, she agreed with a smile. The DA's office wanted me to thank you again for your cooperation. The evidence you helped uncover has given 4 families closure they never thought they'd receive. As evening approached and the demolition crew finished their work, the neighborhood began to return to normal. Children played in yards again, couples walked their dogs past the now empty lot, and the oppressive silence that had characterized Maple Street for months was replaced by the ordinary sounds of suburban life. Mrs. Henderson invited everyone back to her house for coffee and cake, declaring it a celebration of justice finally served. As we gathered in her cozy living room, I felt a profound sense of completion. The promise I'd unknowingly made to Margaret had been fulfilled, not just for her, but for all the women who'd been trapped in that house for decades. There's one more thing, Mrs. Henderson said as we prepared to leave. She handed me a small wrapped package. I found this among Margaret's belongings that her family returned to me. They thought you should have it. Inside was a simple silver locket, tarnished with age. When I opened it, I found a tiny photograph of Margaret and Robert on their wedding day, both looking young and hopeful. But someone had carefully scratched out Robert's face, leaving only Margaret's image intact. She knew, I whispered. Even at the beginning, she somehow knew he was dangerous. Trust your instincts, Mrs. Henderson said softly. Margaret's story taught us that. Trust your instincts, and don't ignore the warnings that your heart tries to give you. 6 months later, I was settled into my new colonial house, which was indeed blissfully free of supernatural activity. The lot where 1247 Maple Street had stood was now a small community garden, where neighbors grew vegetables and children played safely among the raised beds. Detective Morrison called occasionally with updates on related cases. The investigation had uncovered connections to unsolved disappearances in other cities, other houses that might have served similar purposes. But those were battles for other people to fight. I'd learned that some promises bind us to purposes larger than ourselves, that sensitivity to the supernatural comes with obligations we might never expect, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is helping someone find the courage to leave. But most importantly, I'd learned that no house, no matter how beautiful or historic, is worth living with the weight of unresolved tragedy. Some places can be cleansed and redeemed. Others must simply be erased, so that new life can take root in cleaner soil. As I tended my own small garden that evening, planting roses that would bloom in memory of women I'd never met but had come to love, I felt Margaret's presence one final time, not as a trapped spirit seeking justice, but as a friend offering gratitude. Thank you, her voice whispered on the evening breeze. Thank you for keeping your promise. And then she was gone, truly and finally at peace, leaving behind only the sweet scent of roses and the knowledge that sometimes, the most important promises are the ones we make without realizing it. The screaming had stopped. The house was gone. And the dead were finally free to rest. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.